fog was thick that night. It moved slowly through the narrow streets of Whitechapel, curling around gas lamps and hanging like breath over the cobblestones. You walked with your hands in your coat pockets, boots clicking against stone. Somewhere, far off, a dog barked once and went quiet. It was late, and the city had that uneasy stillness you knew too well, the kind that came just before something terrible. You reached your office above a quiet funeral parlor, your usual place of work. It was small, the stairs creaked, and the walls were always a bit damp in winter, but it was home. Your assistant was already inside. He stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the street below, a stocky man with tired eyes and a slight limp. He had worked beside you for most of your short career. "You're back late?" he said without turning. His voice was calm, like someone used to bad news. "I went back to Victorian," you replied, taking off your coat. "Third victim. Same wounds, same strange positioning. So it's true then? Another Ripper case?" your assistant asked. You walked to the desk and pulled out the newspaper. The headline read with a big question mark. "Jack the Ripper returns?" There was a drawing beneath headline, a sketch of the victim. A young woman with her arms were posed unnaturally, one reaching out, the other across her chest, and her eyes were open. You stared at the image in silence. "I don't think it's him," you said quietly. "The Ripper is long gone. But someone wants us to believe he's back." Your assistant finally turned. "Why would someone do that? To spread fear? Or to cover something worse?" you replied. He frowned and moved closer. "You saw the wounds yourself, right?" "I did. And there's something else." You opened the drawer and pulled out your old case journal, the one that was the Ripper. Inside there were notes and sketches from the original murders, one Scotland Yard never shared with the public. You flipped to the last page. It read, "Mary Jane Kelly, the final victim." There was a mark scratched on the wall next to her. "Mark?" your assistant asked. You showed him. A simple symbol. 2 crescent moons facing each other, with a line drawn between them. "I saw it again tonight," you said, "behind the girl's body." Your assistant raised an eyebrow. "Coincidence?" "No, it's too similar," you said. You reached for the map on the wall. It was old and wrinkled, showing the winding streets of the Whitechapel. "We've had 3 victims in 3 nights," you said, pointing to the locations. "Turner Street, Brick Lane, and Gunthorpe Street." You marked each spot with your pen. "See this? It forms a triangle," you said. "A ritual shape?" Your assistant asked. "Exactly. I think this is more than a copycat. Someone's trying to finish something the Ripper started, or claim it for themselves." Your assistant spoke softly. "Do you think it's just one man?" "I'm not sure, but it feels familiar, as if something old has returned." You said. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass like it wanted to come in. The room felt colder. Then came 3 slow, steady taps on the door. You both froze. Your assistant moved first, stepping toward the desk and opening the drawer with the revolver. He didn't touch it, just kept his hand in the revolver. You opened the door. No one stood there. Only a small envelope on the floor. You bent down, picked it up, and opened it. Inside was a single card. The paper was yellowed, and the ink was dark red like blood. 2 words were written in a shaky handwriting. "Hello again." You went to the window and looked out into the street. Nothing but fog and empty silence. You turned the card over. On the back was the same symbol, the twin crescents with the line between. You handed it to your assistant without a word. He read it, then looked up at you and said, "He knows you." You nodded slowly. "Yes, and he wants me to follow him." You stood by the window, staring out at the city swallowed in smoke and shadow. The Ripper may be dead, but someone or something has returned in his name, and it's calling for you. The next morning, the fog still hadn't lifted. It hung low over the city like a bad dream, dulling the light and quieting the streets. Even the horses seemed to trot more slowly, their breath rising in pale clouds. You stood by the window of your office, staring at the rooftops across the street, your hand resting on the envelope from last night. The card inside still sat on your desk. Your assistant entered the room carrying a tray with tea. Didn't sleep, did you? He placed the tray down and handed you a cup. No return address, no fingerprints, and the paper is old. Not something you'd find in shops now. And the ink, you asked? He shook his head and said, still checking, but it's thick. Could be dried blood. You took a sip, even though the tea had already gone cold. Have you heard from Inspector Braith? You asked. Not yet, but he'll come knocking. He doesn't like to admit that he needs help, but he always does. Braith had once told you he didn't trust private detectives, but that he trusted you even less when you weren't involved. A strange compliment, but one you'd taken to heart. There was a knock at the door. Your assistant smiled at you and said, that'll be him. You opened the door to find a tall, thin man in a stiff overcoat. His mustache was twitched as he looked you up and down. Detective, we need to talk, he said. You stepped aside and said, come on in, Inspector. The inspector entered like he owned the place, which in his mind he did. He took off his gloves and looked around, and sat without asking. In his deep voice he said, we've got a problem. 2 more women were found early this morning. Same mutilations. Same posing, but this time in Bethnal Green Street. And worse, they were found together in the same alley. Together? Your assistant repeated. Yes, almost side by side. Like a display, as if the killer wants us to look at it. You felt your stomach drop. That makes 5. You picked up the envelope that you got earlier and handed it to the inspector. He looked at it and said, then he's already started. The inspector took the card, read the words, and studied the symbol. I saw this mark once before, back in '88. Miller's Court, he said quietly. It was near Mary. Jane Kelly's body, I remember. This means whoever is doing this either saw it themselves or was told. The inspector stood and began saying, this isn't some ordinary killer. He's playing a game. He wants attention. And he's leaving these signs for someone to follow. You met his gaze and said, he's leaving them for me. He even sent me a letter that says hello. Your assistant finally spoke. Then we better get ahead of him. You looked back at the map. 5 locations now, all forming a rough circle across the East End. If there was a pattern, it hadn't fully revealed itself yet. But then you remembered something. You opened your old notebook again. Not the Ripper file this time, but an older one, almost forgotten. You flipped past pages filled with strange symbols and stories that had once made your skin crawl. You found the page, a ritual, written in Latin, translated roughly into English, described as the binding of shadows. It spoke of 5 offerings, each laid in points around a city. It called them keys. You read aloud. When the 5th key is placed, the gate is unlocked. Blood in the air, fog on the ground. The spirit may pass. Your assistant stared at the words. You think this isn't just a killer? That it's some kind of a ritual? I don't know what to think, you said. But everything feels too deliberate, too exact. Braith scoffed. You're chasing ghosts now? You closed the book. I'm chasing truth, no matter where it leads. The inspector snorted and stood. Just find him before another body turns up. That's all I care about. As soon as he left, you light up your cigarette and you turn to your assistant. We need to find out where the killer will go next. If this is a ritual, there has to be a final point. The 6th may be the final piece. He stared at you, silent for a moment. Do you think it'll be another victim? You looked at the fog still pressing against the window. Yes, I think the 6th might be something else. A place, an object, or a person. Your assistant smiled and said, what if it's you? Then he said, do you think it could be you? You didn't answer, because somewhere deep inside, a voice you tried to ignore was already whispering the same thought. The map lay flat on the table, corners pinned down by whatever you and your assistant could find. An ink bottle, a revolver, a brass magnifier, and a half-eaten apple neither of you had touched in hours. 5 red dots marked the crimes. 5 women. 5 nights. 5 brutal ritual-like murders in the shape of a perfect circle. You stood in silence, tracing the pattern with your finger, and then you looked in the middle of the map. What's in the middle? Your assistant asked, quietly leaning closer. You squinted and said, an old asylum called St. Anselm's Asylum. Thought that place was shut down years ago, your assistant said. It was closed in 1879. There was a fire. Some say the patients set it. Others say something else started it. There were stories, whispers about the basement, about what they did down there. Your assistant was quiet for a long moment. You think that's where he's going? You lit up your cigarette and said, I think that's where he's been all along. So what now? We go there, you said, before the 6th part of the ritual is complete. The two of you came downstairs, stopped the horse carriage, and rode through the gray streets. The fog hadn't lifted all day, and now that night was falling again, it was getting worse. By the time the carriage reached the edge of Whitechapel, it looked like the whole world had disappeared behind a wall of smoke. You could barely see the shape of the old asylum until you were right in front of it. It stood like a shadow, tall and silent, its stone walls blackened from the fire, windows shattered like broken eyes. You stepped out with your boots crunching over damp gravel. The air smelled of ash and something older, like wet paper and mold. Your assistant pulled a lantern from his coat. I don't like this place. Just keep close, you replied. The front doors were rotting, but it was still locked. You circled around to the back, where part of the wall had collapsed. You stepped inside through that broken wall and felt the air was heavier, as if time itself had stopped when the asylum closed. You moved slowly through the halls. The walls were covered in peeling paint. Old patient records scattered across the floor. Somewhere in the distance, you heard the drip of water. You arrived at the stairwell. A door labeled Staff Only was standing open. No wind, no rats. Just an open door and a darkness waiting below. You lit your own lantern and descended down the stairs. The basement smelled like burnt wood, and rusted metal and chains hung from the walls. In one corner, there was a small stone altar blackened by fire. Your assistant stepped beside you. What the hell is this? Something that doesn't belong in an asylum, you said. On the wall behind the altar, someone had carved a symbol, the 2 crescent moons, the line between. But beneath it, a new mark had been added, a 6th stroke, downward like a dagger. You felt something shift in your chest. You turned slowly and saw a book lying in the center of the floor. It was open. Its pages were cracked and dark, covered in red markings that looked handwritten but not entirely human. The words were twisted in the thick ink. You knelt beside it. Latin, you whispered, but old, older than Church Latin. Your assistant leaned in. What does it say? You translated slowly. The 6th shall open the gate of knowing. One who follows the path bears the cost. Your assistant looked at you and asked, Gate of knowing? And that's when you heard a soft breath. Behind you, just one long exhale. You spun around, raising your lantern. No one was there, but the chains on the far wall had begun to swing gently, as if someone had passed by. Your assistant raised his voice low and careful. Show yourself. You nodded once. Let's leave now. You didn't run. Not yet. But you moved quickly, retracing your steps to the stairs. You both climbed without speaking, your footfalls swallowed by the walls. Back outside, the fog hadn't cleared. If anything, it was even thicker now, pressing in on all sides. As you stepped onto the street, you noticed something new. A figure was standing just across the road, dressed in black, face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. Still, in watching you and your assistant, the two of you froze. And then the figure turned, slowly, and disappeared into the mist. You didn't follow. Instead, you turned to your assistant and said, We've found the 6th point. You looked back at the asylum, its windows glowing faintly from your lanterns inside. Now what? Your assistant asked. You held up the book. Now we find out what the gate is, and what happens when it opens. The fog did not lift with the morning sun. It clung to the windows like breath on glass, thick and unmoving. Even the sound of the city seemed muffled beneath its weight. You sat at your desk, the book from the asylum open before you. Its pages felt older than they should have been. The ink looked fresh in some places, though you knew that wasn't possible. Your assistant leaned over your shoulder, reading in silence. You think this is what he's using to guide the killings? I think it's more than that, you said. This book wasn't just left behind. It was meant to be found. Meant for me. Your assistant raised an eyebrow. A message? Or an invitation? You turned to a page marked with a ribbon. It showed the same crescent symbol, but now surrounded by words in red. Body in darkness, mind in blood. Your assistant rubbed the back of his neck. That doesn't sound like something a sane man would write. Later that afternoon, you took a walk. The fog was worse than ever. Shopkeepers had lit extra lanterns in their windows. Horses moved slowly, and their hooves were cautious against the slick stone. But you needed air, even if it smelled of coal and damp wood. And then you saw him again, standing at the end of a narrow street, half swallowed by fog. A tall man in a long black coat, wide-brimmed hat, perfectly still. Do you see him? You asked your assistant, who walked just a few steps behind. He looked up. Where? You turned back. The figure was gone. But in his place, something fluttered in the air. A small scrap of paper. You stepped forward, caught it before it hit the ground. It was torn from a book. The edges were burned, and a small smear of red ran across the top. Written in dark ink was the phrase, "When the fog is deepest, he will walk in skin not his own." You stared at the words and remembered that Ripper also used to leave notes behind for the police. Your assistant spoke quietly. He's not just copying the Ripper. He thinks he is the Ripper. He thinks he's bringing him back. Back at the office, the room felt colder than before. You lit the lantern even though it was still early. Your assistant boiled tea. You sat with the torn page, turning it over in your hands. It didn't match. The book from the asylum. It was a different parchment, different ink, but the handwriting looked similar. Do you think he wrote it? Your assistant asked. No, I think someone else did. Someone who knew this would happen. He frowned. What do you mean? You looked at the map again. 5 murders. 1 asylum. 1 ritual. And now this strange figure is guiding you step by step. He wants me to follow, you said. He's leaving a trail. But not for the police, but for me. Your assistant didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, and what happens when you reach the end of it? You looked down at your own hands. I don't know. That night, you stayed in the office. The streets outside were quiet. The fog moved like smoke, pressing against the window panes. Even the usual drunkards and barkers seemed to have vanished from Whitechapel's corners. Then, around midnight, you heard a knock. You opened the door slowly. A man stood there, thin, pale, wrinkled clothes and a look in his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. I saw him, he said. You didn't speak. Just stepped aside and let him in. He moved slowly, like someone carrying something heavy in his mind. I saw the man in the fog, not just once. 3 times now. Your assistant offered him a chair. The man sat with eyes wide and fingers trembling. Last night near the river. He stood under the lamplight, and he said a name. He said your name, the man whispered. Said he's been waiting for you. You felt the chill deep in your bones now. What else did he say? The man looked down. He said when the 6th hour comes, the circle will close. And you'll have to choose. Choose what? Your assistant asked. The man didn't answer. He stood slowly and placed a folded note on your desk. I shouldn't have come. He'll know. And with that, he left, vanishing into the fog outside like a ghost. You opened the note. It was blank, except for the symbol, drawn once again in red. But this time a 7th stroke had been added, just beginning to curve into something new, something forming, something waiting. The note on your desk had changed. It still bore the twin crescent moons and the straight line between, but now a new mark curved beneath them, almost forming an eye, or a keyhole, or something older you hadn't yet named. You stared at it in Silence while the fog outside clung to the window like a second skin. Your assistant paced. It's a symbol, obviously. But why change it now? You didn't answer immediately. Instead, you leaned closer, eyes scanning the red ink. It was dry now, flaked at the edges. But there, just above the new curve, you saw it. A smear. Very faint. Ash gray, almost invisible under the lantern light. You reached for a cloth and wiped it gently. Your assistant raised an eyebrow. Ink? You held it to your nose. No, charcoal. Burnt wood. Like from the asylum? He asked. You nodded once. The page was there, somewhere near the fire-damaged walls. He's not writing these from memory. He's collecting them. From where? You looked up. From somewhere that holds the rest of the book. Later that morning, you returned to the ruined Anselm's asylum. This time, the fog followed. You inside. It crept along the stone floors like it belonged there. The basement was as you left it, quiet, charred, wrong. You scanned the floor again. No book this time. No footsteps. But you noticed something else. Scratches. Faint, near the far wall. Not on the stone, but on the metal panel embedded into it. It looked like part of a ventilation shaft. He opened this, you muttered. He used it to get in and out without leaving a trail upstairs. Your assistant leaned closer. And the black powder? You pointed. See how it spreads outward, not inward. He pulled something out, something wide, heavy. The rest of the book? You nodded. He's feeding us pages on purpose. Clues. Symbols, but the full text, he's keeping that close. You stood and brushed ash off your coat. That afternoon, back at your office, you laid out every clue on the table. The notes, the book, the sketch from the first victim, the 5 locations, all of it. You stared at them like pieces of a puzzle, waiting to speak. And then, slowly, you saw it. It's not a circle, you said quietly. Your assistant frowned. What? The map. The murders. Everyone keeps calling it a circle. But it isn't. You picked up the compass and marked each murder again. Then you drew lines, not around, but through. 5 points, intersecting like a star, at the center, Anselm's. And just above it, close but not touching, an old church. You said, the one they shut down 2 years ago after the roof collapsed. I thought the asylum was the ritual site, your assistant said. You shook your head. That was just the door. This, you tapped the church. This might be the destination. You reached street. Jude's just after dusk. The front gates were rusted shut, so you circled around back and slipped through a gap in the wall. The courtyard was overgrown with ivy and thorns. Moss clung to the stones like dry blood. Inside, the pews were shattered, the altar blackened by old fire. But there was something else. Lantern light, flickering, but not yours. You crept forward, staying in the shadows. Your assistant stayed close. Near the altar, a figure stood. Not the man in the fog. Someone else, shorter, nervous, pacing. A young man in a blood-stained coat, holding what looked like another page from the book. You stepped into the light. He turned fast, eyes wide. Don't come closer. You raised your hands slowly. I'm not here to hurt you, he stammered. I swear. I didn't write it. I heard the voice. You kept your voice calm and said, What voice? He swallowed hard. The one in the smoke. The one behind the wall. It said the circle will close. You stepped closer. And did it say where? The man pointed toward the altar. There's a space behind it, a hollow. That's where he said it would begin. You nodded. Thank you. Then your assistant leaned close and whispered, He's bleeding. You looked down. The young man's hand trembled. His coat sleeve darkened with blood. You're hurt. And before you could speak again, he collapsed. Behind him, written, across the back of his coat in drying red blood, 6 complete. The gate opens at 7. You left the church quickly, the echoes still ringing in your ears. The young man had passed out, but he was alive. You sent your assistant to fetch the constable. Now, Walking back through the fog alone, you let your mind work. 6 victims? Or 6 parts? Or 6 symbols? You remembered what the old man said. When the 6th hour comes, the circle will close, and you'll have to choose. And just as you were thinking about it, you looked up as the fog parted slightly ahead. The man in the fog was there again, closer now. This time, he raised his hand slowly, carefully, and pointed at you. Then, just as before, he vanished. Only this time, he left something behind. Lying in the middle of the street, your name, carved into wood, carved into the handle of a knife. The knife sat in your gloved hand like it belonged there. Wooden handle, old, worn, but carved with deliberate care. Your name, every letter etched with something sharp and slow, like it was meant to last forever. No blood on the blade. But it didn't feel clean either. You turned it over again, studying the weight, the grain of the wood. It was older than you expected. No initials of a maker. No unique grooves or patterns that might lead to a craftsman. Just your name. Carved for you. Or to be used on you. Back at the office, you placed the knife beside the book and the symbols. You sat without speaking for a long time. Your assistant finally broke the silence. He's circling closer. You nodded. He wants me to feel it. The pressure. The inevitability. And the knife? You looked at it again. He's not threatening me. He's preparing me. For what? For the final act. You glanced down at the torn ritual page again. Body in darkness. Mind in blood. But now that phrase sounded different. Not poetic. Not spiritual, but literal. He needs me. You said aloud. Your assistant raised an eyebrow. To stop him? You shook your head. To finish it. Later that evening, you visited the old records office, a place few ever bothered with, tucked behind the city clerk's quarters, covered in dust and wax seals. You asked for archives related to St. Jude's Church, its final years before closure. An old clerk handed you a stack of papers with shaking hands. Be careful, he said. Fire got to some, but the worst of it was the basement records. Lost them all. You flipped through birth records, ceremonies, last rites. Then you found something strange. A letter, dated 1878, sent by the last head priest of St. Jude's that read, "We are no longer alone in the walls. The writings we, sealed in the stone, were never meant to be read. I fear the man who keeps returning to pray here is not the man he once was." Your assistant read over your shoulder. He was writing about someone, a worshiper. You turned the letter over and noticed something unusual. The handwriting small, neat, but with one slight quirk. The lowercase r looped too high, nearly touching the line above. You grabbed the most recent torn ritual note, compared them side by side. It was the same R written in the same style. Your assistant immediately said, "They match." You tapped your finger on the page. He's not just finishing a ritual. He's continuing someone else's work. Someone who started it long before these murders. Back at the office, night had fallen. The fog was rising again. You placed the knife in a glass case and locked it shut. Then, for the first time in days, you let yourself sleep. You dreamt of narrow halls, stone beneath your feet, shadows on the walls. A door at the end, sealed in red wax, with a symbol you knew too well, the twin crescents. You woke with a start to the sound of your assistant's voice. Someone's outside. You sat up fast. He pointed to the window. You stood and looked down. A figure, again, standing across the street. But this time it wasn't him. It was the nervous man from St. Jude's, the one who had fainted. You opened the door before he could knock. He looked worse than before. Pale, shaking. His coat was torn and covered in soot. "I went back," he whispered. "Back to the church. I had to. I had to see if it was still there." "If what was still there?" You asked. He reached into his coat and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. You opened it slowly. Another page, burned at the edges. The ink was almost unreadable, but there, at the top, was a drawing. A man in chains, kneeling, surrounded by 7 standing. Figures, each holding a knife. 7 knives, 7 names. Your name was at the center. What is this? Your assistant asked. The man's voice cracked. I think it's a warning. But he said it again before I left. Said what? You asked. That you're the last piece. That the knife isn't for your heart. You froze. He looked up. It's for your hand. The room fell into silence. Outside, the fog thickened. Inside, you stared at the blade. Again, still clean, still untouched. You understood now. This wasn't about stopping the ritual. You were meant to complete it. But why? What would happen if you refused? And what would happen if you didn't? You held the knife again that night, not as a weapon, but as a question. Its blade glinted under the lantern light. Cold, quiet, waiting. Your name carved into the handle still felt fresh under your thumb, as if it had only just been etched. You had cleaned it twice. It hadn't needed cleaning. You sat in silence while your assistant watched from the doorway. Everything we found points to this, he said. But I still don't understand. Why you? You didn't answer. Instead, your eyes moved to the drawings from the recovered page. The one the nervous man had brought last night. 7 figures. 6 holding blades, 1 kneeling. But the 7th was different. It stood alone. Its blade is pointing down, not up. Not part of the ritual, but above it. You traced the figure with your finger. He's not trying to kill me, you said finally. He wants me to kill someone else. Your assistant stepped forward. You think he's grooming you? No, you replied quietly. I think he's trying to convince me that I've been a part of this from the beginning. You let that idea settle into the room like ash. Outside, the street was quiet again. No horses, no shouting vendors. Not even the usual footsteps overhead. The city had gone still. The fog was rising. You walked out just after midnight. No plan, no weapons. Just the knife hidden beneath your coat and the torn page in your pocket. You followed instinct more than direction, but deep down, part of you knew where to go. St. Jude's Church. You reached it before the hour turned. The ruins were darker now. The broken cross on the roof bent even further, as if bowing to something just out of sight. Your assistant followed, silent at your side. As you passed through the threshold, the air changed, thicker, heavier, like breathing through fabric. Your boots crunched over shards of wood and broken glass. Faint crunching, you reached the altar. The lanterns you'd seen before were still burning. That was your first clue. Nobody in Whitechapel leaves lamps burning without a reason. You knelt behind the altar again, ran your hand along the stone. This time, your fingers found a groove. A small circular latch, hidden under the black sand. You pressed it. The floor groaned. A section of the altar base slid open, revealing steps. Spiral, and narrow, descending into the earth. Stay close, you said, and don't speak unless I speak first. You began your descent. The air below the church was cold and wet. Moss clung to the walls. The light from your lantern flickered as the stairs curved sharply left, then again to the right. When you reached the bottom, you knew immediately. This was not a basement. This was a crypt, and it had been used recently. Dust was disturbed. Footprints crossed over each other in chaotic loops. Burned candles sat in metal holders, melted down to wax puddles. And in the center of the crypt, a man. He stood with his back to you, black coat, gray-streaked hair, hands clasped behind him. Still, perfectly still. You stopped a few paces behind him. I was wondering when you'd call me down. You said. He turned around and said, only those who listen can hear the gate when it breathes. Your assistant reached for his revolver. You raised a hand and said, wait. You took a step forward. You've left a lot of trails behind. Pages, symbols, victims. His face was pale, almost sickly, eyes rimmed with shadow. You misunderstand, he said. The victims were not sacrifices. They were messengers. He pointed upward, toward the church ceiling above. To call him, to remind him that his work isn't finished. You narrowed your eyes. Jack the Ripper is dead. The man smiled faintly. Not dead. Dormant. Echoed. He lives in all who watch. In all who remember. And now, in you. You? Stepped forward slowly. Why me? Because you see, he said. You followed the signs. You opened the gate. Even before I touched a blade, you are already tracing the circle. Your voice dropped. Why the knife? He stepped aside. Behind him sat a stone pedestal. Laid across it, 6 knives, each different. Each bloodied, and a 7th empty slot. I made the space, he said. But I never had the 7th. It had to come to me. You reached inside your coat, drew the blade, held it in your hand like a puzzle piece fitting into place. The man's eyes lit up. Finish it, he whispered. Your assistant moved behind you. You felt the weight of the moment press against your back. Then you looked at the knives again. You dropped the knife onto the floor. It clattered loudly. No, you said. The man flinched. You've been chasing shadows, you told him. Rituals, symbols, echoes of a man who died a long time ago. You wanted to keep Jack the Ripper alive. But you can't do that now. Then your assistant quickly moved in and latched onto him. He pinned the man before he could reach his pocket. You took the man in the cuffs and held the revolver to his head. And as you climbed the stone stairs, you felt the fog begin to shift. Not clearing, but changing, pulling back, losing strength. 4. The first time in weeks, you saw the edge of dawn above the city. For the first time in weeks, the sun rose without fog. Its pale light spread over Whitechapel's rooftops like a slow, cautious hand. The gas lamps were finally allowed to die out. Footsteps returned to the streets. The scent of coal gave way to morning bread and carriage dust. You took him to the police station, and they placed him in a holding cell. You stood in the corner of the observation room, arms folded behind your back, eyes locked on the man sitting behind the bars. He didn't look like a monster now. No coat, no ritual. Just a prisoner in a gray smock, staring at the wall like he could still see something you couldn't. You turned to the guard beside you. Has he asked for anything? The guard nodded. One thing. A mirror. You frowned. Why? The guard shrugged. Said he wants to see which face he's wearing. You then left the station and put your hat back on. The air was clearer now. The shadows not as long. But your steps slowed each time you passed a certain alley. A lamppost. A puddle. The city didn't look the same. And it wasn't because it had changed. It was because you had. Every detail now demanded attention. Every stain on the wall, every broken window, every footprint half covered in dust. You found yourself walking to the first. Murder scene again. No police tape now, just memory. You crouched near the cobblestones and studied the ground. The blood had long been cleaned that evening. You sat by the window, watching the street. Children played. A vendor shouted about oranges. A woman laughed. As she crossed the road, it felt like peace. You tried to return to smaller cases. Missing persons, family disputes, petty theft, but nothing held your attention. Every knock at your door made you expect another photograph, another invitation.